Adam is Israel. And you know, that really, honestly, that shouldn't be too hard to swallow or too hard to even comprehend. Sometimes I think it's right beneath our noses and we miss it because we don't really want to see it, I don't think. Like the fact that Paul said in Galatians chapter 4, for example, speaking of Abraham, Sarah, Hagar, that they were allegory, okay? Literally, which things are allegorized? For these, he's speaking of Sarah, Hagar, are two covenants. Sarah and Hagar, these are two covenants. Okay, and I know what you're thinking. Wait a minute. Are you saying Abraham wasn't a real dude? Here's the truth, Ruth. Most of the Bible is allegory. Now look, that doesn't mean that there's not history or there's not historical facts within it. Ain't saying that. But the basic literary genre of the Hebrew Scriptures is myth. It's mythological. Now let me be clear. Myth does not mean false. It doesn't equate to being false. Myth doesn't mean that it's not true. It's not the same thing. You have to understand what myth is. Okay, now look, I understand that that's how most use it today, and it really is myth. The definition really has kind of morphed into that more or less. When people say myth, you say it's an untrue story. That's not really what myth was. Okay, but the opposite of myth is not false. Myth is a genre largely unfamiliar to us today. Well, we think it is, but we have superheroes. We have Superman. We have Batman. We have superheroes, right? We get all that. But the Bible is a metaphorical book. It's a story filled with stories, filled with allegory, filled with symbols, filled with figurative language, used to paint pictures by the prophets and reveal literal truths about literal things such as a people's history, a people's creation, okay? But the ancients, they didn't tell their stories, tell their histories like we tend to, like through a high school textbook filled with straightforward facts and numbers and all that. No. And I think what might be even more confusing to us today is that I think very likely that the ancient cultures like Israel, they documented their story, their creation as a people, their history. They made sense of their world by weaving together metaphorical parallels and stories and poetry all together into their actual literal history, okay, through mythological stories that explain their world, that explain their current situation, that explain their history, that explain their belief system, okay? So back to Adam here. How can Adam have been Israel's first father? Well, I think it's pretty easy, really, if we simply allow and we understand what type of literature the Bible is, in fact, that we're reading. It really shouldn't come as a surprise that Adam was Israel's mythical first father. No, a human being named Adam did not actually exist. Not in my opinion. Can you prove that he did? Well, no. Can I prove that he didn't? No, I can't, but I can put together a cumulative scriptural case, I think, based on the entirety of scriptures, and maybe that's what I need to do. And I'm sure I can find, and I've seen some corroborative evidence through other ancient sources or texts. I think we could do that. I believe that the Genesis account and Adam himself was constructed later on in Israel's history. Perhaps during the Babylonian captivity, some people have suggested that, to tell, to explain, to document, to reiterate, to make sense of their history and their situation, their world. Israel would not have been the first ancient people to do this. And that's what we have to understand. Far from it. Far, far from it. They simply communicated and understood their way of doing things in the most natural way that all, like all other surrounding cultures did at that time. But here's the thing. It's up to us to get into their mind and their mindset, not to conform their writings to our minds. You see the difference there? We cannot presuppose something into their writing. We have to take their writing and we have to conform our understanding of their writing. What kind of literature are we reading here? What is Scripture? And I'm here to tell you, I don't think Scripture is what we've been told it is, what we've been taught it is, and what we've assumed that it is. And I think that, my friends, is the great interpretive dilemma that a lot of people, I think, are really starting to catch wind of and to see. So, you know what? I kind of dig this topic. It's kind of fun. Matthew chapter 23, Jesus is just laying into the religious leaders of his day. He is just lambasting them, nailing them to the wall. And this is right before he talks to his disciples about the destruction of the temple, that thing was going down. But before he does that, he's talking to those pious, religious scribes and Pharisees of his generation. How about Matthew 23, 29 through 30? Here's what he says. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! You're hypocrites! Because you build the tombs of the prophets and adorn the monuments of the righteous, and you say, if we had lived in the days of our fathers, we would not have been partakers with them in the blood of the prophets. Question: what days are in view here? Well, again, he is speaking to Israel's religious leaders, and he's looking back to the days of their fathers, Israel's fathers. So just like the scribes and the Pharisees would in Jesus' day, their leaders, their fathers, they persecuted and they killed their prophets, Israel's prophets. And they certainly persecuted Jesus, and they would certainly do so likewise to his followers after his death, according to the story of the New Testament. Matthew 23, 32. Fill up then, he says, the measure of your fathers, or of your father's guilt. So do a little contextual word study, if you want, on fathers, okay? And you're going to see that the dominant use of fathers throughout the Bible were fathers. They were the patriarchs. They were the leaders of Israel, the fathers of Israel. So who was guilty here? Well, obviously their fathers, Israel's fathers, who'd murdered the prophets before them. And they too, that generation that Jesus was speaking to, as they were filling up the measure of their father's guilt, they were doing the same thing that their fathers had done throughout the generations. Now wait a minute. Murdered the prophets. What prophets? Whose prophets? Well, the prophets of, yeah, you guessed it, Israel. Israel, Israel, Israel. The entirety of Scripture is a story of a covenant people, Israel. Their covenant beginning, or their covenant creation. This story, I think, is mediated. It's told through the long line of prophets. Israel's prophets, prophets of and to Israel. So how many times in the New Testament do we see the phrase like, all that the prophets have spoken? Well, it's everywhere, okay? Matthew 23, 35. Let's continue on. That on you may come all the righteous blood shed on the earth, from the blood of righteous Abel Abel, remember that, Abel, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. So who's the you here? Jesus says you. That is Jesus' immediate audience, the religious leaders of that generation of Israel. They were the final, they were the last perverse and crooked generation of Israel that was long prophesied to come to her end, to their latter end. Deuteronomy chapter 32. When or who did the killing of Israel's prophets begin with? Who was the very first prophet to be murdered? Abel. Well, there you go. There's Abel again. Number 2, what does this make Abel? Well, the inescapable conclusion is that Abel was Israel's first prophet. And if you don't think Abel was a prophet, Luke 11:50 through 51 would disagree with you. Number 3, who murdered Abel? Well, I think we all know that. That was Cain. Well, who did Jesus explicitly say killed Israel's prophets? Well, according to Matthew 23, what we just read, their fathers, Israel's fathers, the fathers of Israel killed their prophets. So, if Cain was the first to murder Israel's first prophet Abel, what does that make Cain? He would be a father of Israel. Imagine that. Number 6. So, if Abel was the first murdered prophet of Israel, and Cain was a father of Israel, and Adam was their daddy, what does that make Adam? That would make Adam Israel's first father. And that, my friends, would agree with Isaiah 43:27. Your first father sinned, and your mediators have transgressed against me. If indeed that is referring to Adam, I believe it is. That is up for dispute. Let me just drop a couple bombshells here by saying this. The Bible is the story of Israel, not mankind. Okay? Adam was the father of a covenant world Israel, not the entire world, not the entire planet, not all of mankind. And I know this comes as a shocker for many of you, but if Adam was the father of all humanity, then why was only Israel held responsible for all the blood of Israel's prophets that began with Abel? There's that Abel guy again. All mankind was not held responsible. I don't think Rome was judged in AD 70. I don't think Greece was. I don't think Australia was. I don't think China was, right? Or any other nation was held accountable except and specifically and only Israel. They were judged for the killing of Israel's prophets that began with Abel. Okay, so Jesus said that all the blood of Abel to the blood of Zacharias would be required of Israel in that generation, AD 70, okay? And that makes no sense if Israel didn't begin with Adam. We have to employ some logic here. That's a reasonable thing to conclude. I think it's the inescapable conclusion. And why was Israel judged for killing Abel? Only because Abel was a prophet of Israel, just like all the prophets. See, that's what the entirety of the Old Testament is really about. It's Yahweh sending His prophets to His people Israel, His chosen people. And time again, what did Israel do? Well, they persecuted and they killed their prophets. It's all over the Old Testament, right? And where does that story begin? Well, it begins in Genesis with Adam and the subsequent persecution and the killing of Abel by his brother Cain. Cain and Abel painting a picture of Israel in her last days. But in any case, folks, I know what you're thinking. Here's what you're thinking. Israel didn't even exist for like 2,500 years or something after Adam, right? The nation of Israel began in earnest really like with Moses and the Exodus and the giving of the law at Sinai and all that. Or you could say at the very earliest, Israel began like with Abraham, Isaac, then you got Jacob, who really became Israel, and he produced the 12 tribes, which became Israel. Look, and I know, according to the story, you would be correct on that. If we follow the literal chronology of the story, that would be correct. But we ought not be deceived and blinded by our overly literal and Western way of interpreting an ancient and Eastern minded text. Contrary to what I think most of us have been told and taught, the Bible, it's not a history book. The Bible is not a history book. I'm sorry. Much less a history book of the entire planet, beginning with the creation of the physical cosmos, laid out in a very literal, linear fashion. No, the truth is, the Bible is not really what we've been taught to believe at all, in my opinion. Okay? I'd say Christianity at large has swallowed wholesale a supposed literal historical narrative of the planet Earth and its inhabitants that kind of really ends up, it's funny how it ends up. It ends up as sort of a Christian fantasy type ending, with some of those inhabitants literally being sucked off the planet at the end of the story. Now look, I think I've got a better, more reasonable approach. The Bible is a collection of Near Eastern texts written about and for a particular people within that ancient world in which it was written. Okay? The collection of writings provides an ancient perspective that we have failed to recognize, much less even understand some 2, 3, 4,000 years, removed in both time and removed in culture. We're a long way off here, folks. The Bible, beginning in Genesis and the story of Adam, is metaphor. It's metaphor for Israel's covenant creation and their fall, if you will. Like Adam, they fell. Adam represents Israel.